this is Sarang Noether. He's been part of the Monero Research Lab for how many years? Like 4 years?
On and off part-time for a little bit, and then about 1 year full-time.
So yeah, on and off for quite a long time, and then full-time for about 1 year. He's funded entirely by the community through Forum Funding System proposal, which gets renewed periodically. And he's a super smart guy, and I hope you enjoy his talk.
All right, thank you very much. So I will cut my talk just slightly short to respect all of your time. My real name is Aaron, but I go by Sarang Noether, and I am one of the 2 full-time funded members of the Monero Research Lab. And as Paul said, that is a work group of the Monero project completely funded by the community. And Paul kind of gave you some, I don't care about that. Oh man, this was going so great. We're back. It's still going great. Hey, we're back now. Cool. And I'm gonna talk to you guys a little bit about kind of some of the technology that underlies different private assets. So privacy is something that's talked a lot about in the blockchain space. There is no single way to do it, and frankly, there is no single best way to do it. Under certain assumptions, I think that Monero does a pretty fine job, but I want to introduce you to a few of the different ways that you might see presented to do fungible assets. So as we know, the dirty truth is that in, for example, the Bitcoin ecosystem, transactions are not done, in fact, anonymously. They are done pseudonymously, where in effect, you replace your identity with that of a particular cryptographic key. And a given transaction on the blockchain identifies, oh man, this thing sucks, identifies the sending address, the receiving addresses, and the amount. That's a lot of data flowing around. So I can go ahead and look up transactions like this one from last year that was about $6.8 million. And in fact, I can tell you what address sent those funds, where they went, and I can tell you all the other times that these particular parties interacted. It turns out it was a lot. I have no idea what they did, but it was a ton of money. That's problematic. And in the real world, this actually does affect analysis. There are companies that the only thing that they do is Bitcoin and other transparent blockchain analysis to tell you what is going on, what parties are interacting, and what they might be up to. There are all sorts of different ways that you can look at a transparent chain, and I'm not going to go into all of these, but if you know any of these words, you know that chain analysis companies are very interested in them. You basically get to build out a big graph of Bitcoin transactions, for example, and that leaks a lot of information if you're good at data analysis, and plenty of people are. The end result of this is, in general, it is not a good idea to assume any transparent Bitcoin-style ledger offers you any true anonymity. This was very, very widely misunderstood when Bitcoin first came out, and I think it's something that we're now starting to realize is, in fact, very true for a lot of people in the real world. So I like to think about digital assets and cryptocurrencies, you might want to call them. I don't like the word cryptocurrency. I like digital assets. I can kind of think of like a distributed ledger as having different scales. One of them is availability, and I consider that to be public versus private. So an example is that Monero, Zcash, Bitcoin are all public ledgers. You can download the ledger and you can do whatever you want with it. You can transact on it, operate on it, analyze it if you want to. And different applications, as many people in this room probably know, might be private. So certain ledgers that may be used by the healthcare industry or the banking industry, for example, might use the same kinds of technologies, but you as an individual might not be able to transact on them. And completely separately from this is the visibility of information on those ledgers. So let's call that transparent versus the opposite, opaque. Bitcoin and other ones that, for example, Paul introduced kind of originally when he talked about privacy, like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and things like that, are in fact transparent. As we've seen, you can look at the blockchain and identify what's going on in different transactions. In other chains like Monero and others, they're opaque in that the information contained about senders and recipients and maybe even amounts are not visible to anyone analyzing the chain. Although we can be sure that transactions are done honestly and accurately. So in effect, our goal is to get a public, that is publicly available chain or ledger that is opaque, that is, we can call it private in that sense, right? I don't want to be able to see who's transacting or, for example, what the amounts and other metadata are. And of course, as Paul talked a bit about, and as I'm sure Naveen's going to talk about later, there's also many applications, things like healthcare, regulated banking, and business that in effect require a private base layer. So large corporations are not going to want to use a public transparent ledger to conduct business. Certain banking regulations, require that data be kept private. So how do we do this? It's important to keep in mind that throughout everything I'm going to talk about, there are big trade-offs to actual practical privacy. These exist whether or not people want to talk about them. So privacy itself, for example, we might want identities and things like amounts to be completely private if we are interacting on an opaque blockchain. However, things like law enforcement and other national security concerns might kind of come at odds with that. I'm sure the FBI, the NSA, and many other folks who do analysis would love to know what those identities and amounts are. So these things are at odds. There's also a lot of efficiency concerns at odds. So for example, I definitely want my transactions on my kind of ideal blockchain to not take a lot of time to download and verify if I need to do so in order to verify the chain. I want to make sure that transactions are typically very small so they don't bloat the chain and require me to download a ton of data to use it. And I also want, for example, device requirements to be kept pretty small. If I can't use the chain application on my mobile device, for example, that's probably a problem. And I also want the design of the chain to ensure that correct user behavior is the default behavior. So I like the phrase tyranny of the default, which says if you set up a system for users to use and there are options available, the user is going to use the default option. It's just the one that's presented to them. They don't want to do research to find out what alternatives are available. So we need to make sure as we're designing digital assets that the correct options are the default options. And there's some projects that do this well. I think we're becoming better at it with Monero. And there's other projects that I think are not doing this well. So we always have to keep in mind that there are trade-offs to all of these things when we're talking about privacy and fungibility. I'm going to skip over one of these case studies, and let's move on to one case study that I'm really interested in. It's not Monero, it's Zcash. Has anyone heard of Zcash? That's right, you're all traders. You know what Zcash is. Yes, traders, not traitors. I don't view anyone like that. Let's look at Zcash as an interesting example that uses a very particular kind of technology toward fungibility and privacy. So Zcash launched in 2014. It's both a protocol that is a cryptographic transaction protocol, and it's also an asset that you can buy, sell, and trade. And it basically uses two different types of addresses, transparent addresses and shielded addresses. When you transact, you get to decide which of these you use. If you choose transparent addresses, they work exactly like in Bitcoin. There is effectively no privacy. Sender, recipient, and amount are completely transparent and open. Technology is identical. But shielded transactions with shielded addresses hide the sender and receiver with a very complete, great anonymity set. It's not possible to tell who's transacting, as well as the amount. So there's all sorts of different spend types you can do. I can send from a shielded address back to a transparent address or vice versa. There's a lot of different ways to do this. And in particular, the initialization of the Zcash system, when they first kind of launched and bootstrapped their chain, did require a trusted setup process among a very small number of participants. And in fact, if this trusted setup process were compromised, it would be possible to print free Zcash. And in fact, there was a recent flaw that was revealed by the Zcash company that was kind of around this process. The technology they use is sometimes called zero-knowledge succinct non-interactive arguments of knowledge, or ZK snarks. They call it fancy moon math. It's fascinating and very interesting, but fairly complicated. And what it effectively does is it allows them to ensure that anybody can verify that all transactions done on this chain are done correctly with no funny business, while at the same time being able to give you both this transparent and private shielded behavior. But one issue with this is that privacy is optional. Like I said, you get to decide how you interact with the Zcash blockchain, transparently or shielded, or maybe some weird mixture of both. So it used to be that shielded transactions were very, very expensive to generate. You couldn't do it on your mobile phone, for example. This is not true anymore. They had a recent protocol upgrade that did address this. And in particular, exchanges tend generally not to support these shielded operations because, for perhaps regulatory reasons, they might like transparent operations to be preferred. So what this means is that it's actually possible to link amounts that go into the shielded pool, for example, if you want to hide your activity, with amounts that are coming back out into the transparent pool, for example, if you need to interact with an exchange. So if I see 15 Zcash going from Alice to Bob into this shielded pool, and I see 14.9998 Zcash coming back out of the shielded pool to Carol, a very short amount of time later, this accounts for fees in the transaction, for example, that I can be pretty sure that there's a solid linkage between those. So I'm not supposed to be able to link transaction behavior in Zcash, but it's definitely possible to do so. And in fact, a lot of Zcash behavior is linkable in this way. So this is problematic, and it's a cause or an effect of the cause, which is optional privacy. And there's several other attack vectors that are also common to the way that Bitcoin can be analyzed, involving different address clustering and things with exchanges and the founders who get paid from a development reward and things like that. In general, my motto is that optional privacy, it involves choices that the user has to make, and as we know, the user is going to make the easiest choice, and that is not always the best choice. It is worth noting that Zcash did recently deploy a protocol upgrade called Sapling, and the intent was to make shielded transactions more efficient and encourage their use. Whether or not this happens is yet to be determined. I hope it does. The other case study is Monero. we now know exactly what Monero is. And I'll talk to you about how Monero does a different job toward privacy and fungibility than other projects like Zcash. It uses a combination of technologies. So Monero is a cryptocurrency or digital asset. It does not allow transparent transactions at all. It used to be the case that you could optionally use a form of transparent transaction very early in its history, but this is no longer the case. So the senders are anonymous within a fairly small group of possible senders. Recipients in a transaction are fully anonymous, and the amounts are hidden using some fancy fun algebra. Unlike Zcash, for example, which uses a very big, unified, complex transaction model, Monero effectively takes a layered approach. It uses something called ring signatures to ensure sender obfuscation. It uses a one-time address approach to kind of mask who the recipient is, and it uses a particular confidential transaction model to hide what the amount of the transaction is. Much as in Zcash, it's possible for any user of the chain to verify that transactions are done correctly, no funny business happens, while still maintaining these modes of confidentiality. So in one-time addresses, unlike Bitcoin, where your address does in fact appear on the chain fairly in the clear, in Monero, your wallet address never appears on the blockchain. So every single transaction generates a unique one-time address that cannot be mathematically linked to the recipient's actual wallet address. That's great. So, however, having control of the wallet address basically provides that person, the recipient, authority to later spend those funds. So it can mitigate against some, but not all, forms of transaction linking by making all the destinations of transactions look unique. Ring signatures are used in Monero to kind of mask and obfuscate the sender of a transaction. So it's basically a cryptographic instruction, and it proves that one out of a group of possible sending one-time addresses is in fact the true sender. So ideally, you're not able to identify which of the outputs on the chain is being later sent in a transaction. And again, these are all these special one-time addresses. Your wallet address never actually appears on the chain like in Bitcoin, Ethereum, or others. So senders are obfuscated, but in a way that's different than in, for say Zcash. And finally, Monero's confidential transaction model, we internally sometimes call it ring CT, basically hides the amounts in a particular cryptographic instruction called a commitment. What this means is that an observer does not gain any information about the input or output amounts in a transaction. All they know is that the transaction balances properly, no money was created. So this whole layered approach effectively means that some previously spent transaction output in a group of possible senders is sent to an unknown recipient with an unknown amount, and everything happened properly with no funny business. So what can possibly go wrong with this? Well, there's a few things that can go wrong. Monero has a fairly small sender anonymity set. That is, the number of possible senders in a transaction is fairly limited. So what this means is that this is generally fine as long as those one-time addresses are not known to be spent or unspent. So in Bitcoin, they have unspent transaction outputs and spent transaction outputs. Ideally in Monero, you shouldn't be able to tell the difference because we're using these as a certain type of decoy set. So there's all sorts of different cases where we don't want addresses to be known, spent or unspent. And if we don't do this correctly, it's possible for an adversary to kind of gain some kind of heuristic or statistical information about what a true spender might be. This isn't provable information about what the sender of a transaction might be, but it's something that might give the adversary a statistical advantage. So how do we mitigate these kinds of things? So we have all sorts of approaches. So we know that many old transaction outputs early in our chain were spent. Well, it's possible to not use those as decoys in these rings that we're constructing. And there's all sorts of different ways to do it, involving things like timing or transaction parameters. But like Paul said, Monero iterates frequently on its transaction protocol, so we're able to iterate on these things and make them better and kind of mitigate some of these concerns that are caused by having these small anonymity sets. So it's a consequence of design choices that we make, but for pretty good reasons. So what is basically the current state of the art? I mean, Monero and Zcash have two very different approaches toward fungibility and privacy, but they are not the only approaches. You've all probably heard of Grin and or Beam or Mimblewimble or all that. Maybe? Yes, many people have. You've also probably heard many magical things about them. I mean, I think the privacy and fungibility guarantees and claims of Grin, Beam, and Mimblewimble are fairly widely misunderstood. In some sense, they're pretty good. In some sense, maybe not so much. But there are alternate approaches, among others, that are being developed toward privacy and fungibility. The ones I presented are definitely not the only ones. But generally, current trends in cryptographic approaches toward privacy and fungibility tend to involve a lot of trade-offs, like I had said before. One of them is efficiency. Typically, whether or not you're willing to accept centralized trust, like in the case of Zcash, or a kind of distributed trust, like in the case of Monero, tends to affect efficiency. Zcash gets certain forms of efficiency that Monero does not get, because Zcash in general is willing to accept more centralized trust. Other current trends tend to involve things like, do I take an existing transparent protocol and add some kind of mixing approach like CoinJoin? Well, that's different than what we do. Ours is a non-mixing protocol that works a lot differently. And finally, different cryptographic approaches, things like accumulators, ring signatures, and all sorts of other things that attempt to achieve spend anonymity. Whether or not you're able to do these things better or worse depends on a lot of trade-offs involving cryptographic complexity and your trust model. Ideally, everyone in the space is working towards some kind of solution that is trustless, zero knowledge, meaning it doesn't leak any information, very high anonymity, low metadata being leaked, and very efficient. It's a very, very tall order. I claim that no one has fully figured this out yet. So what are the pro tips when you're trying to analyze a project that comes out that claims to be private? First of all, privacy has to be defined. Big, broad, vague claims without a lot of analysis are probably full of it. Privacy cannot be optional. As we've seen, we have plenty of examples, many more than I've stated here, where when privacy is optional, it's very easy to lose anonymity and fungibility. I mean, even Monero suffered from similar problems when its privacy used to be optional. Integration of privacy approaches is very tricky, and it is very, very subtle. A lot of projects make it sound like you're building a Lego house. Like, I want a garage on my Lego house. Clearly, I can just bolt it on. Privacy doesn't really work like that. It's more like taking your gas-powered car and saying, I really wish this were an electric car. Clearly, I can just rip the engine out and throw a motor in there. We know it doesn't work like that. You would probably somehow end up killing yourself. Building a cryptographic system is not like a Lego house. It is possible to add things and change protocols, but it has to be done very, very carefully. Flaws matter, but response matters too. A good quality project should be willing to understand and accept its limitations. We try to do that at Monero as we iterate our protocols. The math has to be vetted. If the math sounds way too good to be true, it probably is. Any project can come out with a fancy looking white paper, but that is not the same thing as having vetted academic mathematics. And finally, you have to consider your trust model. The structure of an asset or a blockchain application is very, very crucially tied to the trust profile of its participants. For example, if you know how to use Zcash properly and you are willing to accept the trust model of Zcash, it's a great asset. If you are willing instead to accept the fact that, Monero's lack of centralized trust, does have its own trade-offs, Monero could be very good for you, as could many other similar projects. So these are some of the pro tips that I would look for. So I have now depressed you thoroughly by saying that privacy is currently, impossible to achieve perfectly, but many different projects, including Monero, take a very iterated approach to try to improve on it over time, trying to do the best we can with the ideology upon which we're based. So I'd be glad to talk with any of you about any of the mathy details about this later, but thank you very much for your time.